Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. Level B 1. Oxford Reading University. Part 1.
Mr. Utterson was a lawyer. He lived in London in the late 19th century. One day he was taking a walk with his good friend, Mr. Richard Enfield. They were walking down a wealthy street with nice houses. Suddenly, they noticed a house that was very different from the rest. It looked dark and forgotten. The door was damaged and had neither bell nor knocker. When Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield came closer to that house, Mr. Enfield pointed at it. "Do you see that door?" he asked. "It reminds me of a very odd story." "Indeed?" said Mr. Utterson with a light change of voice. "What was it?" "Well, it was this way," replied Mr. Enfield. "One winter night I was walking down an empty street. Suddenly I noticed two figures. One of them was a short man walking at a very fast pace. The other one was a little girl, running as fast as she could. They ran into each other. But then a horrible thing happened. The man calmly walked over the girl's body and left her screaming on the ground. I ran after the man and grabbed him. There was already a small crowd of people gathered around the scene. Someone called for a doctor, and he soon arrived. Apparently the child was more frightened than injured, but still we couldn't let that awful man go. The doctor and I shouted at him, saying that we could make his name known and hated all over London. "All right," he said. "As a gentleman, I wouldn't want to cause a scene. Name your price." We agreed that he should pay £100 to the child's family. He then went into that house and returned with a check for £90. The check was signed by a well-known name, which seemed very strange. "If you're worried," the man said, "I'll wait with you until the morning and cash it myself in the bank." Indeed, the check was accepted and we successfully paid the girl's family. "Well, it surely is a strange case," said Utterson. "I know," replied Enfield. "But the strangest of all was the feeling that the doctor and I got from that man. I had such a strong dislike for him. There was something so unpleasant and ugly in his look that I came home that night covered in sweat." "What about the name on the check? Who was it?" asked Utterson. "I wouldn't like to tell you to avoid gossip."
English courses, famous audiobooks for all levels, word games, and rating charts to keep you motivated. All in one place, the Ava app. Don't just learn English, enjoy it. Check out appewa.com right now.
But believe me, he's a very honest, generous man who does plenty of good. I suppose he is being blackmailed, paying for some careless things he did in his youth. "And do you know if the writer of the check lives in this house?" asked Utterson. "That would seem likely, but no. I saw his address on the check. He lives somewhere else," replied Enfield. "But I was very intrigued about this place. I never asked about it, but I studied it myself for a bit. There is only one door, and no one seems to be using it, apart from that strange gentleman. The windows are shut but always clean, and there is smoke coming out of the chimney sometimes. Someone must be living there." They both went silent and walked like this for a while. Then Utterson said, "Can you tell me the name of the man who walked over the poor child?" "Why not? His name was Hyde." "I see," said Utterson. "And what sort of man was he?" "It's extremely difficult to explain," replied Enfield. "There is something very unusual about his appearance, and yet I am unable to point out any specific feature. I just felt so much hate towards him, but I don't know why." Did he use a key when he entered the house? Utterson asked. Yes, he had a key, and he still has it. I saw him use it the other day. But I'm afraid I've said too much already. The two men agreed to never refer to the matter ever again. When Utterson came back home that evening, many thoughts were weighing down on him. He had dinner without pleasure, and went up to his study. Since recently he had been in charge of a will made by his friend and client, Dr. Henry Jekyll. The will stated that if Dr. Jekyll died or disappeared for longer than 3 months, all his possessions had to be immediately passed to his friend, Edward Hyde. Even before Utterson knew anything about Hyde, this idea had seemed like madness to him. Now, knowing what kind of man Hyde was, Utterson considered the situation quite disturbing. Hyde's character was not the only thing that made Utterson so uncomfortable. He was now presented with a more troubling mystery. Utterson knew that the door Enfield had talked about led to Dr. Jekyll's laboratory. Utterson guessed that the name on the check was likely Dr. Jekyll's. So what was the relation between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Utterson couldn't imagine what sort of business his friend had got involved in. Utterson thought that Dr. Lanyon possibly knew something about Hyde. Dr. Lanyon was an old friend of his and of Dr. Jekyll's. So Utterson put on his coat and went to pay him a visit. After a short chat about all sorts of things, the lawyer raised the question that had been worrying him so much. "I suppose, Lanyon," he said, "you and I must be the two oldest friends that Henry Jekyll has." "I wish the friends were younger," said Dr. Lanyon with a smile, "but I suppose we are, though I have to admit I hardly ever see him now." "Really?" said Utterson. "I thought you shared common interests." "We had," was the reply, "but it's been more than 10 years since Henry Jekyll lost all common sense. And though I obviously continue to take an interest in him because we're old friends, he's not the way he used to be anymore. He's gone mad. Whatever he does," added the doctor, his face suddenly becoming almost purple, "it lacks any scientific value." This calmed Utterson down a little. He thought the two doctors had just disagreed on some scientific question, which seemed perfectly normal. Then he asked the question he had been planning to ask. "Have you ever heard about a friend of his? Someone named Hyde?" Utterson said. "Hyde?" repeated Lanyon. "No, it doesn't sound familiar." Utterson came back home, but the situation still worried him. He kept thinking about it, and even had scary dreams. Finally, he decided to spend some time near that old building, hoping to see Hyde for himself. After several days, he got what he wished for. It was a clear, dry night. Utterson had been at his post for some time when he heard the sound of light footsteps. A moment later, the lawyer saw a small man dressed in simple clothing. The man went straight to the door and took out a key. That was when Utterson touched him on the shoulder. "Mr. Hyde?" "That is my name," the man answered coolly, not looking Utterson in the face. "What do you want?" "I see you are going in," replied the lawyer. "I am Henry Jekyll's old friend, and I thought you could let me in." "He is not home," said Hyde, not lifting his head. "How did you recognize me?" "I'll tell you if you do me a favor in return," said Utterson. "Let me see your face." Hyde paused for a moment, then turned to face Utterson. They looked at each other for a few seconds. Then Utterson said, "Good. Now I will be able to recognize you again. It might be useful." "Yes, maybe," replied Hyde. "I also think you should have my address just in case," he said, and gave Utterson a number of a street in Soho. Good God! Is he aware of Jekyll's will? Wondered Utterson, but did not say anything out loud. "So," said Hyde, "how did you recognize me?" "By description," Utterson replied. "Whose description?" "We have common friends," Utterson explained. "Common friends?" repeated Hyde in a low voice. "Who are they?" "Jekyll, for example," said the lawyer. "He never told you," shouted Hyde, suddenly angry. "You're lying." He turned the key in a hurry and disappeared into the house. Utterson was confused. He also felt something was strangely evil about Hyde's face, and yet he could not tell what exactly. Poor Henry Jekyll, he thought. I'm afraid this new friend of yours is a bad influence. Around the corner was a street with neat, beautiful houses. One of them belonged to Dr. Jekyll. Utterson stopped by the door and knocked. A well-dressed, aged servant opened the door. "Is Dr. Jekyll home, Poole?" asked the lawyer. "I will see, Mr. Utterson," said the servant, and he disappeared into the house. He came back and said that Jekyll had gone out. Utterson was surprisingly glad to hear that. He asked Poole whether Mr. Hyde had his own key to Dr. Jekyll's old laboratory, and Poole confirmed that. He said they had orders from Dr. Jekyll to obey Mr. Hyde, which bothered Utterson quite a lot. 2 weeks later, Dr. Jekyll gave one of his nice dinners for his old friends. Utterson was there, and he decided to stay a little longer to talk to Jekyll. "I've been wanting to speak to you, Jekyll," he began. "It's about that will you have made." If someone had been watching the scene, they would have noticed that the topic was uncomfortable for both of them. Still, Jekyll tried to look cheerful. "I know you never liked it. You have told me so." "Well, I'm telling you that again," said the lawyer. "I've been learning something about young Hyde. I'm convinced that you're in trouble." Jekyll's large face grew pale, and his eyes darkened. "I don't want to hear more about that. You don't understand my position. It's very complex and painful. It's one of those situations that you cannot fix by talking. You know I'm a reliable man, and I'm your friend," said Utterson. "It is my duty to help you if I can." "My dear Utterson," said the doctor, "it's very good of you, and I believe you fully, but I'm afraid it's a private matter. Perhaps it will calm you down if I tell you that I can break free from Hyde the moment I choose to." Utterson looked into the fire and was silent for a minute. "I have no doubt you are perfectly right," he said at last. "Well, since we already mentioned that business, there's one thing I'd like to ask you," continued Jekyll. "I have a great interest in that young man. I know you've seen him, and maybe he was rude to you, but I don't ask you to like him. I simply need you to promise that you will help him when I'm gone." Utterson let out a loud sigh. "I promise," he said. Nearly a year later, London was shocked by a particularly violent killing. That night, a servant girl was sitting by the window when she noticed an old man walking down the street. A small young man walked towards him The girl recognized him as Mr. Hyde, a man who had once visited her master. The old man stopped and said something to the young one, very politely. Hyde had a cane in his hand. The girl could see he was impatient and did not answer a word. Suddenly he exploded with anger and shook his cane in front of the old man. The old man took a step back. That was when Hyde knocked him down to the ground and beat him up with his cane. The maid was in such a horror that she fell unconscious. She only woke up at 2 o'clock and called the police. When they came, the body of the victim still lay on the ground. The criminal's stick had broken, and one of the halves lay next to the body. The dead man still had his money and his golden watch, but there were no cards or papers apart from one. It was a letter with the name and address of Mr. Utterson. The letter was brought to the lawyer. Utterson was told about the murder, so he hurried to the police station to identify the body. He recognized the dead man. It was Sir Danvers Carew, a popular politician, and his client. Remembering that he still had Hyde's address, Utterson told the policeman to follow him. When they arrived, Utterson was surprised. The neighborhood was very poor. A pale, gray-haired woman opened the door. She said that Mr. Hyde lived there, but he was not at home. Utterson said that one of them was a police officer. He explained that they wanted to see Mr. Hyde's rooms. The woman asked whether Hyde was in trouble, and seemed strangely happy about it. Inside the rooms they found the other half of the stick and a burned checkbook. After that, Utterson and the policeman decided to go to the bank. At the bank, they learnt that Hyde still had an account there. They wanted to wait for Hyde to come to the bank for money, but in the following weeks he did not come. No one they asked could say where Hyde had gone. No one could describe his face, but everyone agreed that there was something absolutely evil about it. Late in the afternoon, Utterson found his way to Jekyll's house. Jekyll's servant Poole took him through the kitchen and then across the yard to the old laboratory. Utterson had never been inside it before, so he looked around with interest. He went up the stairs and entered Jekyll's study. A fire was lit in the room. Jekyll sat next to it, looking so sick, as if he was dying. "I think you've heard the news," began Utterson. "Carew was my client just like you, and I need to know one thing. You're not hiding the criminal anywhere, are you?" "Utterson, I promise you I'll never see him again," cried the doctor. "He's quite safe now, and no one will ever hear about him. I've received an important letter, but I'm not quite sure if I should show it to the police." "Are you afraid they will find him with the help of this letter?" asked Utterson. "I don't care about Hyde anymore. I just don't want my name to be mentioned." "Well, will you take a look at the letter?" It was written in a strange, pointy handwriting. "Do not fear for my safety," it said. "I can escape any time I need to." "Did it come by post?" asked Utterson. "No. Someone just gave it to Poole." "I will reflect on what to do with it," said Utterson. "Now tell me about that section in your will when you talk about your death or disappearance. Did Hyde tell you to write it?" "Yes," said Jekyll, suddenly frightened. "Well, he probably intended to murder you. You can consider yourself lucky." On his way out, Utterson asked Poole about the person that had delivered the letter.
Part 2 is coming soon. hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more free audiobooks like this. And now, here's another English story for you.